Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin. Welcome to the webinar. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I want to get started right on time. We have a lot to cover today. So a couple really quick housekeeping things. We have a lot of attendees, which is wonderful. But if there's any technical questions or technical issues, you can type that into the question section. So the main thing that I like to remind people of, because I think on your end of the interface, you might have a hand-raising feature as well. The challenge with that, especially with so many attendees, yes, this training is being recorded and it'll be available as a recording later. So if you do have questions, and I'm glad some people are already using this, type those into the question section. If you have technical concerns, same thing, but I wouldn't suggest using the hand-raising feature because I won't really be able to see who it is or be able to address that concern directly that way. So we'll have someone keeping an eye out if anyone's typing in any technical issues and do our best to help with that. It sounds like people can hear me so far, so that's good. That is kind of the main thing in terms of housekeeping. We really do have a lot to go over. Hopefully we can have some time at the end for some Q&A, but again, for the amount of attendees, if I don't get to your question, it's not because it's not important or that I don't want to, just logistically in terms of time and amount of people, I may not get to everyone's questions at the end. So just wanted to say that up front. And if you wanted further resources, if you needed to talk to a counselor, that is always available to you. You know, after this ends, you can go on our website for more resources. You can call our main number and I'll have that contact info at the end. So if you needed anything further, that you have that information as well. So why don't we get into it? And quickly, just my background, I've been with Cascade for about 6 years. I've been a clinician for over 10. My background's in trauma psychology. I've done a lot of clinical work as well as teaching. And I think it's really important to have this conversation. And so I hope that, we can get started and talk about this. All right. So I want to start by saying that as a white person, I cannot speak to how Black people are feeling right now. But my goal for this webinar is to discuss some important concepts and provide information that demonstrates really how widespread systemic racism is, and then talk about some strategies to be a more effective ally. I do not have all the answers or claim to know everything, but I do really hope this webinar can at least start a conversation and help people feel more empowered to take action. So this outline, again, is just sort of an overview of what we're going to talk about. Obviously, this content and every single slide in this presentation, we could have a whole presentation just on that, and I totally understand that. I will do my best to give some information and provide as much as I can while realizing, of course, could be a much longer conversation as well. So I don't want to feel too much like we're rushing it, but I do really want to make sure we get to all of the key concepts here. So when we think about injustice, which is in the title of the presentation, it's simply put, as it says here, is a violation of rights. What I think is important, and we'll get into this more when we talk about systemic versus systematic racism, is that sometimes we can have a narrow idea of injustice as a violation of rights in terms of it being like just within legal rights. But injustice is oftentimes much deeper than that. And what I appreciated from this philosopher here is how she kind of breaks down these other levels of injustice. The terms she uses for them, are kind of big words, but I think the concepts are pretty simple. They might be simple, but they are very pervasive and can be extremely toxic and dangerous. So if we think about this of these other levels of injustice, this first one, testimonial, a person or people not being considered credible or trustworthy because of the prejudice of the people or person listening to them. And I'll talk later in the presentation about white privilege, but there's other types of privilege too. And what happens a lot with groups who experience chronic and consistent injustice is that they're not taken seriously, they're not taken as credible, and it's an unbelievably horrible experience. And so having these conversations or trying to make change can be really challenging when this sort of testimonial system is also happening. It sounds like one person is saying they're not hearing audio. I think other people could hear me, so hopefully that's all okay. So I'll keep going, but if there's any other issues, certainly let me know. So with this other level of, okay, it sounds like other people can hear me. Wonderful, so I'm gonna keep going. So this other level of injustice is thinking about, when someone's personal or social experiences are hidden or denied from communal understanding. So I think what is coming up right now is a realization, maybe from a lot of people who hadn't or have had the privilege, which we'll talk about later, to not maybe think about this directly, is the narratives that communities and societies provide that sort of leave out entire experiences of groups. And that also is part of that injustice, is like, if we don't talk about it, we're going to pretend it's not there, and then no change happens. So this is why it's so important to talk about it. And I thought this was a good kind of starting point to describe injustice on a more, what I would say, kind of holistic perspective that included kind of the systematic and systemic process. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean there. And I know white privilege is not on this list. That's because we are talking about that a little bit later. So I'm definitely not skipping over that. Probably most of us understand what bias is. And I'm not here to read slides, but thinking about kind of our bias and then how that is then when that gets translated into action. And when we think about bias, obviously there's racism, sexism, all sorts of, ableism, the list goes on. So when we have a bias against a certain group and then that translates into action, and I think it's important, again, to understand systematic versus systemic. And it can sound confusing. It's like those sound almost identical, but the way that I describe it, and we'll give some examples later too, is when I think about systematic, I think more like policies and laws. So systematic may be, if a group of people weren't allowed to vote, or a group of people, there wasn't anything protecting them from discrimination. We saw this recently in the law that passed in terms of the protecting LGBTQ rights in the workplace, like these kind of like larger legal systematic policies or laws. The other level, though, is the systemic. So even if maybe a law is passed that protects a group's rights, and that is a wonderful thing, that's a great step, it doesn't necessarily mean just because that law is passed that systemic racism isn't still happening. So this, I think, is about understanding, not getting caught up in complacency, because we can think, well, these people, in this group or this demographic now have a law passed or have systematic, rights around this. It doesn't mean that suddenly the community doesn't still have a lot of sort of underlying chronic racism still happening that directly impacts that group of people and everybody. So I like to differentiate those a little bit, because they are two different things, and they also play off each other in terms of how we think about moving forward and trying to promote anti-racism. I did see someone may have raised their hand. I know some people may have joined later. It's hard for the hand raising function because I can't really see who's raising their hand or why. If you have a question or something comes up, just type that into the question section. I'll do my best to address it either at the time or at the end. So I want to talk a little bit about different areas of our community, our society, that systemic racism is a part of, and again, systematic as well. But when we think about this in terms of systemic racism, there's long-term discrimination and trauma there's a lot of research around how that directly connects to people's physical health. We don't have enough time to get into like all of the research around generational trauma, but that is also something. So if there's, when there are groups of individuals who have always been oppressed over a very, very long time, that there's a generational trauma that occurs as well. And so one thing I want to clarify on this slide is that some of you might not know what that acronym means there on that second bullet point. So that is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. You'll see that acronym on multiple slides, and I want to make sure everybody knows what that stands for. So just wanted to put that information there before moving on. So when we're thinking about individuals within that demographic, statistically speaking, more likely to live in food deserts. If some of you aren't familiar with what that is, I think that there's been more education around that, still not enough. So it's really a limited proximity to grocery stores. So these are found primarily in Black and brown low-income neighborhoods. And, you know, this is, again, directly connected to someone's health and ability to have healthy foods. There's also limited access to green spaces statistically, living in areas without clean water or air. And then this was, of course, a more recent statistic here from the CDC talking about death rates from COVID-19 per 100,000 people in NYC. And just seeing these numbers sometimes, I just think that so much of this conversation has to start with getting some information around this and seeing how significant it is, and that we can't just not think about this or not be aware of what's going on. We have to learn about this information and continue to learn about it and try to make real changes. So thinking about other factors, and again, these are some examples. I am not going to pretend that this is a completely exhaustive list of every statistic or every single factor. So I recognize that. Here are just some others, but this is a really big one. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit about kind of the criminal justice system and that situation as well later on. But this is a really big piece, you know, when we're thinking about health, and it's, I think, especially kind of coming into people's awareness a little bit more around COVID-19, is that, you know, racial, ethnic minority groups are absolutely overrepresented in prisons and detention centers. And it's pretty much impossible to social distance in those places. So a huge increase of risk based on living conditions. We also, you know, thinking about essential workers and looking at these statistics here. So who's at a higher risk? And then, you know, there's also the challenge, of course, with lack of paid sick leave. A lot of times in terms of certain essential worker jobs, there isn't paid sick leave. There isn't maybe PTO. They may or may not be able to get insurance through their work. So it's like all of these just multi-level factors coming into play. And then a very valid and real distrust of the healthcare system. So not only is it harder for a lot of people to access it based on logistical things like having health insurance and time to even go seek care, there's also, again, a very real concern and fear of accessing the healthcare system. So I want to kind of show a couple of statistics here that relate to that. And these are not very long ago. And that's something I also think is important to be aware of. These are from a few years ago. So we're looking at, you know, on average, wait times are longer for Black patients compared to white patients, just waiting to get help in an emergency department. And then this one here about the Stanford School of Medicine study. This is 18,000 babies. So this is a huge study over 4 years that's finding that on average, you know, these babies in this study, Black and Latinx babies are receiving fewer tests and time-sensitive exams, and were more likely to develop infections from sloppy care. This is horrible and awful, and it's incredibly sad to even hear about, but we have to be aware of these systems in place, and I think this is, again, what we're describing in terms of systemic racism, is that there can be a law passed in terms of non-discrimination laws and these different things, but in the day-to-day practice, there is still this chronic underlying systemic racism that impacts the way that people are treated. And the outcome is physical health, mental health, every level of a person's life. And I think it's, again, uncomfortable to hear this information or think about it, but it's very real. And everyone has to think about it. And I'll talk about how that relates to privilege later, but I wanted to provide as much concrete information and facts around this to really make sure that it was clear of how real this is and how this is still pervasive currently. One thing that I'll mention on the earlier slide about essential workers, or trying to how that was broken down. Sometimes people will say, well, get a better job then, all the kind of put it again back on the individual. But there's studies, and some of you may know this, some of you may not, there's been multiple studies in terms of hiring practice and racism in hiring practices. They've done a lot of studies around, giving fake resumes to managers and having some of those resumes have stereotypically Black sounding names versus stereotypically white sounding names. And across the board, the ones with white sounding names get way more callbacks. There's these consistent, just in every area, systemic racism. So this is where it's like very valid to have distrust of a medical system, or struggling to, if someone's like, well, then get a better job so you can have insurance, that's not that easy. We have to pay attention to these systems and these barriers and how that plays out. So redlining is something that, as you can see, started a long time ago. This is another, I think, clear example of systematic versus systemic. So this was essentially kind of started around in the 30s, where banks were denying mortgages to people, again, within this demographic in urban areas. And then over time, this is leading to all these other groups, basically notating certain geographic areas that were basically just off limits for issuing loans. So, and I'll show you a stat on the next slide of more racial discrimination when it comes to housing. And as you can see here, redlining itself, although it was illegal since 1977, doesn't mean that all of a sudden there's just equal treatment in terms of housing. So yes, that's good that that's illegal now, but we can't be thinking, okay, we're good now, everything's equal. So as you can see on this next slide, just so I can kind of give you a visual here. So this is a likelihood of experiencing racial discrimination when trying to rent or buy housing by race or ethnicity. So this is from Harvard from 2017. So again, just a few years ago. And what we're looking at here is that likelihood of experiencing discrimination. So a law that, outlaws redlining may have been a very long time ago. Again, that's great that that law was passed, but up until today, this systemic racism is still happening. So it's just these long-term, horrible, traumatic, consistent, systemic racism and inequality and injustice and inequity that's happening. And the worst thing we can do is be complacent or not pay attention to this, or think that, that law was passed, so everything's good now. And I know I've said that multiple times. I want to, as much as possible, sort of cover these different areas like housing, employment, medical treatment, all of these barriers that individuals are up against, that we, within a privileged group, if you're in, a white person, don't have to think about. So, I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but sometimes just seeing these numbers and seeing this as still a current topic is critical. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about sort of the protests going on and all of that. What I want to say about kind of this graph. So this graph is certainly not implying at all that all police officers are racist. What it's doing is showing yet another area of our society, and we've seen many others, where systemic racism still exists. So this is embedded in every area of our society. This is one of them. Another statistic that isn't on this slide, but I wanted to share, that's related to the criminal justice system, is that, and this is a statistic from 2016 from the Bureau of Justice, is that 1 in 3 Black men will go to prison in their lifetime compared to 1 in 17 white men. So that is a very notable statistic to be aware of. So one suggestion I would share, and I have a slide later on with some resources, there's an excellent documentary called 13th on Netflix that is specifically about the social justice system and the history of systemic and systematic racism within that. So if you wanted more information, I would definitely watch that if you have access to Netflix. But these are just a couple, again, statistics to really remind ourselves that this is everywhere. This is an experience that no matter what area of society we're in, it's going on. Okay, I wanted to spend some time on this. Here's what I want to say right away, is that myself, nor anyone else at Cascade, obviously, has any intention whatsoever to tell anyone what their political beliefs should be, what their personal opinions should be. What I want to do, ideally, is provide information so people can feel like they can make educated decisions for themselves. And I felt like it was important to talk about this briefly because it's something that I've noticed, and we've, if you're watching the news or anything, it's come up a lot of confusion about what this means. So I'm not talking about this because I'm trying to project any opinion about it in terms of what other people should feel in terms of their idea of what reform looks like or any political affiliation. Again, nothing like that. Oh, and someone asked about the statistic about the 1 in 3 versus 1 in 17. Yes, that's in the US. So just kind of wanted to, again, on this slide, this isn't to project any opinions or telling someone they're supposed to feel a certain way. What I will say about this is that there's been, I think, again, a lot of confusion about what does defund the police mean. And as the protests continue to, be going on, and people might, have signs that say that, what's happened is that people, or some people, obviously, not everyone, but some people think what it means is just completely defund the police. Let's not have police anymore. That's not what that means. So I don't think anyone is asking to just eliminate the police force. And there's been a misconception, I think, amongst some people, or, obviously not everyone, that is what it means. And the challenge, if that is the assumption of what that means, the conversation around solutions sort of ends. And so we can't have sort of a realistic, supportive, productive, I guess, conversation about what reform looks like if we don't even know sort of like what we're talking about. So I thought it was important to explain what quote unquote defund the police in terms of the protest means. So again, they will still, of course, continue to be funded. What it's talking about is that some of the funds that were going to the police would go to other social services. So some of those would be reallocated. This is not an exhaustive list. This is examples. A common one that comes up when this is talked about is more like crisis mental health counselors. So much, and I'm sorry, I don't have an exact statistic. I'm sure they're out there. So much of what calls to police is a mental health crisis. And I'm not going to read this whole quote over here, but I thought it was important and notable because it's from a police chief. And what he's talking about, I think, really speaks to this topic, is that we're asking one sort of group of people to do a ton of different skills. And what the argument, I think, in terms of when people are asking to defund the police is ideally to benefit the community and the police. And one thing that someone was saying in an interview is that if a person calls 911, they basically get 3 options. So if there's a fire truck shows up. If there's a medical emergency, an ambulance shows up, and then everything else, it goes to the cops. So, and again, this is exactly what this individual is saying in this quote is, how is that sort of sustainable? And so that is where the conversation around some reform is intending to talk about. And I hope that, number one, again, I can't say this enough, I'm not here to tell people what their personal opinion should be, what their political affiliation should be, what they should think. But I think no matter what the topic, any way that we can describe things in a way that are as accurate as possible, to then each person can make their own separate personal opinion about how they feel about that. And ideally, again, have a productive conversation around some reform that, of course, hopefully helps everybody. And as we saw in the earlier statistics, every level of the criminal justice system, as with all of the other systems I talked about, has systemic racism in that. And so this is, kind of a twofold discussion, is thinking in general, we need to talk about kind of what the goal of defund the police is in terms of what the protesters are saying to help the community and the police on a larger scale. And also take a very serious look at that systemic racism as well that's going on, not just with the police, but again, there's tons of research around if people are at trial, depending on race, like how likely they are to be seen as guilty or not. Like there's multiple levels of systemic racism that is happening. So of course, it's way too reductionist to claim that everyone who's protesting right now has the same opinion. So I'm not saying that no protester at any point has ever said that they wish there was no police. I'm sure there's been protesters out there that want that. I'm sure everybody has a million different opinions if we were to look at the whole wide kind of spectrum. I think that as a whole, the overall average primary consensus around what the concept of defund the police based on the protests means is that they are not just completely eliminated or defunded completely, but those funds get some of those funds get reallocated. So I want to continue on so we have time to talk about some other topics as well, but just thought it would be important to at least touch on this to have a little bit of information about it. Okay, so let's talk about white privilege. I think it is very important, especially these kind of bottom two bullet points, because white privilege can be a very challenging term, let alone conversation, for white people. And it doesn't mean and does not suggest that white people have never struggled. It also does not assume that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. One of the biggest misconceptions when people hear white privilege is the word privilege. So they hear, not everyone, but there's sometimes this immediate response of, are you claiming that I have a ton of money or that I'm privileged in terms of like economically? That's not the assumption. So what happens when that is kind of the first reaction is, again, kind of a shutdown of an open communication about it, because the person's like, you're not even describing me, and feel like you're implying that all white people are rich. And I'll give some examples on the next slide of white privilege. So maybe it can hopefully break that down even more specifically. But these are, at least from my experience, or kind of when we think about talking about this, two very common, like immediate barriers to open communication about this. And to sort of try to separate out what this actually means, because if someone thinks it's just about that they have economic privilege, they just kind of write off that conversation and be like, you don't even understand me and this doesn't define me at all. So kind of trying to bring that conversation to more of a safe place to have a better understanding. So really this is, again, as this definition, advantages that all white people gain at the expense of Black, Indigenous, people of color, regardless of economic position. So let's look at some examples. I think it's always helpful to be like, okay, so then what are you talking about? This list of examples is definitely not exhaustive, but just a few. So you can turn on the TV, you can read the news, and you're able to see your race widely represented. I will talk a little bit about curriculum in schools here in a moment, but you can be sure that children are given curricular materials that are primarily from your race's point of view. As an adult, you can take a job, enroll in school without coworkers, classmates, assuming that you only got there because of your race. People say something like, oh, they're trying to fill this diversity quota. And that is, again, inappropriate. And then you're also, this is a big one too. So you're never asked to speak for all people of your race. And this happens a lot with demographics. Of course, people of color, but other demographics too that don't fall into sort of the privileged group. And then these other ones, again, are kind of more logistical, and you can easily find books, dolls, toys featuring your race. If you've never once had to consider that when you go to the grocery store or CVS, that Band-Aids are not going to be your skin color, that is privilege that you've never had to think of that. I think about this also. Another example in terms of like ableism, if you've never had to think to yourself, I wonder if the place I'm about to go is wheelchair accessible, that's another sign of privilege. So it's like these ways that they're just things that the privileged group doesn't have to consider. And I know that there's been obviously updates to emojis, but the original set of emojis is kind of what I'm talking about, as well as beyond that too still. So, and these are not related to whether a person has economic privilege. These are just like life privileges that people experience. I know there's a lot of words on these slides, and I kind of went back and forth in deciding on the next slide if I wanted to put the whole quote on there, but I do want to. So I am going to, and again, I know that some people might be, sometimes I see a pop-up of like hand raising. I just don't know who's raising their hand. So if you do have a question or a concern in terms of like tech problems or about content, type that into the question section. I can see if I can answer it now. If I can't, or then I can maybe hopefully try to answer it at the end. So these are some examples. I'm going to read the quote on the next slide and then talk a little bit about kind of how the education system comes into play here. So bear with me. I'm going to read this whole thing. All right, let me move my screen here so I can. So white privilege is not just the power to find what you need in a convenience store or to move through the world without your race defining your interactions. It's not just the subconscious comfort of seeing a world that serves you as normal. It's also the power to remain silent in the face of racial inequity. It's the power to weigh the need for protest or confrontation against the discomfort or inconvenience of speaking up. It's getting to choose when and where you want to take a stand, and it's knowing that you and your humanity are safe. And I think that at least I felt like it was a well-written explanation of that, because it really is more than, like I said, just thinking, oh, white privilege is implying that I'm rich, or these things. It's a much more embedded systemic process that even the ability to not be aware of it is a sign of privilege, which I feel like is kind of what that other quote here was saying too. If you don't think it exists, you're enjoying the benefits of it. So if it's never crossed your mind, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. That's the other thing. This isn't about like blaming people or shaming, because blame and shame is never a motivator or appropriate. So, when we're talking about this, and I'll talk again kind of about allyship here in a moment, it's just about awareness. So if we get caught up in, kind of that guilty feelings, or we can't sit with it, we have to do our own work to be able to sit with it, and pay attention to that, and do that in a way that tries to avoid the defensiveness piece, but actually just look at that and think about it. So what's one thing, in terms of, people are like, okay, well, what do we do? A lot of this is around representation, and I'll talk here in a minute about some kind of steps of possible steps forward and things to do. But I think a lot about the education system. So when we think about, say, like maybe just like a college curriculum or options, it's always so interesting. We start to look at it, is there's like, history 101 and then African American history. And it's always like, well, then what is just history 101 implying? So what the challenge is there is like, how do we even educate ourselves around this? And I think, as someone in a position as a teacher at any level, it's certainly not, I'm not talking about just college, but any level, a lot of education systems, certainly not all of them, kind of have their curriculum they've used for a long time, and they're used to that curriculum, and they just kind of going about their day. But thinking, regardless of what role you are in terms of your job, all of us can make a difference and fight against racism. I think if it's something related, as an example, to the education system of thinking, if I'm, say, an English teacher, how am I providing, equitable voices here? And are the last 5 books all been by white men? And what does that say in terms of kind of the voices that we're hearing and the narratives we're hearing and validating? So taking that extra step, we all need to think about representation. That's not the one solution, obviously, but anything that we can do to pay attention to that, to improve that representation, is important. So I'm just looking quickly here because it looks like someone typed in a question. Yeah, I think that, it's white privilege is a topic that, like, as I had said earlier, every one of these topics in this presentation could be like an entire presentation in itself. And thinking about this and how kind of we define something like white privilege, how we start considering how this impacts us and our world, it's a discussion that absolutely warrants, a longer discussion. I hope this is a starting point to start thinking about it and, kind of starting that self-awareness process. Okay. Someone had asked about reading the last question out loud. I'm not entirely sure. Oh, it sounds like, let's see, I do want to address the questions that are coming through. What I'm going to do is do some Q&A at the end, just so we can kind of move through some of the content. So I don't want anyone to feel ignored, but I'm going to kind of jump through here and then allow some time at the end for some added Q&A. All right, so I think there can also be questions around kind of the allyship pitfalls, if you will. And again, it's just a starting point to sort of think about this and think, what are some goals to start thinking about how to fight against racism? So when we're talking about being aware of outrage, I was looking at some examples, and this stuck with me when I was reading about this, because I think it is kind of interesting to consider and may not be something that comes up a lot when we're thinking about some pitfalls around this. And so being aware of, this isn't saying don't be outraged, so I'm not trying to say that at all, but being aware of how and when we kind of express that, because, in some cases, being completely shocked and outraged about kind of systemic and systematic racism in and of itself is an indicator of privilege, of like having never thought about this until now. Again, that doesn't make anyone a bad person. That doesn't mean that you don't care. But thinking this is all maybe new information to me and I'm outraged by it and I'm upset by it. I need to kind of process some of those emotions and then, kind of do my own work to process some of those emotions and then think, what are some concrete strategies I can focus on to fight against this now? So social media is a big one. I think not everyone, but most people probably on average are on some social media platform fairly consistently, just in terms of how our world is today. And I think that, there's sometimes an urge to say something on social media. People love to shame and label people for not posting the right thing or not posting enough or posting too much. And it can turn into just a not particularly productive system of blaming and comparing. And also that social justice and fighting against racism is not just posting on social media. I'm not saying that because that I'm implying it's wrong to, but thinking, we can get caught up in, I have to post this because people say I need to post a lot or I'm posting too much, but focusing on like, what can I actually focus on that I can do too that's a kind of concrete step. And the next slide, we'll talk about some of those. But, maybe every time I post about it, I also do something that no one knows about, like donate, do something to assist in this process as well. So just kind of being aware of how social media is impacting that, both kind of individually and systemically, and how we are relating to that in this process of trying to make change. So with white guilt, this is a term that, again, is pretty common. So I think it's a common experience of human nature, if we start paying attention to and learning this information, to feel uncomfortable about it. If we're identified as being in a privileged group, to not really know how to sit with that. It's easy to get defensive. If we're not defensive, we're feeling guilty about it. And it doesn't help very much because it's kind of just making it about us. And so trying to think, again, sort of like that top bullet point, if I'm feeling an emotion, as a therapist personally, I'm never going to tell someone they should or shouldn't feel some way, because that's not possible. We have initial emotional reactions. It's more what we do about it. So thinking, here's some emotions that are coming up for me, and I'm going to process through those and then try to focus on how to move through that and process that, and then try to do some sort of proactive, productive things that I can do to try to help with this. So the other thing too, and the shaming piece, I think this is where this is related similarly, kind of that social media, is there's a difference between directly and specifically calling out racism and blanket shaming. So this is where kind of the social media piece comes in, of like just overarching blanket shaming. Like, shaming is not really a very good motivator. And so people get into these kind of back and forth arguments on social media and argue with people, and it just is these cycles. It's like, how is that helping anyone? So it's just a completely different process than a direct, respectful, clear interruption of racism, versus we're just going to get into this kind of like this picture is like just finger pointing, shaming like large groups. And we see this a little bit on social media too, but not just on there. So being careful not to get caught up in that. Debating as well, kind of similar. I think, sometimes it's hard because people get kind of lost in debates with individuals who are so deeply entrenched in racist ideology, and it's thinking, is this a productive conversation or not? We can be frustrated, we can be angry, but thinking, is this conversation productive, or am I just frustrated and angry and this isn't actually getting anyone anywhere? And how do I kind of use that frustration and anger in a more productive way? And then this comes up too, so this can sometimes be an allyship pitfall, and it's a little bit related to those examples of white privilege where, not totally exactly the same, but like, don't ask a person of color to talk about, like, be the representation for everyone of their race. And also, it's not that a person of color's job to educate you. So we have to take the time to educate ourselves. This does not mean that we don't have open communication and conversations, but it's just being aware of that, this is a lot about us taking our own time to educate ourselves. And I'll give you some resources here in a moment with, books, podcasts, documentaries, of being able to kind of take that time to educate yourself. Checking how we're doing on time. You're doing okay. I know it's a lot, and I apologize that hopefully I realize it can feel like we're just like rushing through this. Again, I cannot say enough that every one of these slides could be an entire training in itself. So I'm doing my best to try to provide some information, but I apologize if it feels like we're moving pretty fast through here. I do want to make sure that we cover everything and hopefully have some time for Q&A. So we kind of went over the pitfalls, but what are some more effective ways to be an ally? So this is where we have to really practice self-awareness. And I think that's been part of what we've talked about, or I've talked about in the slides so far, that if we are in denial, if we're avoiding it, if we're kind of unwilling to look at ourselves and our own either privileges or how we are talking about this or how we respond to feedback, like all of those things, there's just no room for growth. And when we are, humans in general are very skilled at avoidance and denial. And if anything is uncomfortable, that is oftentimes a strategy, not necessarily consciously. And so it can be challenging to kind of push through that and be like, I am uncomfortable, or it feels different to start really paying attention to these implicit biases, you know, and what assumptions do I have about Black people, people of color, about these systems that I'm in? Have I, again, even looked at that before? And if you haven't before, this isn't about, again, this isn't about shaming. This isn't implying that someone's a bad person. It's a step to take to think, I don't think I have ever thought about this before, and now I'm going to start, you know? And so having that ability to just start that process. The other thing, and this is the second bullet point that I thought was important to add on this slide, is that people sometimes are like, all right, I can start doing some self-awareness. I can kind of start, you know, educating myself a little bit more. And then the second someone maybe calls them out on either a racist statement or behavior, it's really hard for people to get feedback that is uncomfortable for them to hear, or that they felt like, you know, or that they did make a mistake in terms of a comment or behavior, you know, intentional or unintentional. And in any context, receiving sort of critical feedback from another person is very difficult for people. And so this is where I think for each individual, it's practicing and learning how to be able to effectively respond. So a lot of that is not jumping straight into defensiveness and shutting down that conversation, not falling into a bunch of excuses, not immediately putting it back on them, and being able to say, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I appreciate you doing that. I will work on not doing that again. You know, so it sounds like an easy sentence, but it's really hard for a lot of people. And again, that's part of human nature. So that's a big piece of the self-awareness, is how do I sit with the discomfort of that, and kind of push through that defensiveness to be able to have a conversation and be willing to make changes and get that feedback. And then again, continuing to look at how white privilege affects you if you're white. I'm not saying obviously everybody who's listening right now is, but you know, how does this affect me, and have I ever really thought of that before? And are there things that I can do to try to change the systems that we're all in? As you can see on the next one here, vote. I also want to recognize, and again, because we only had like 50 minutes today, we could do an entire separate conversation about voter laws too. So I'm certainly not ignorant to the fact that that's a big piece, yet another piece of systemic and systematic racism. But it's important to, you know, again, be involved and vote and research the systems that are going on. For many people, they want to donate, and it can be very difficult to even know where to start. And charities and organizations in general can be hard to navigate. And as you can see, Charity Navigator, there you go, of thinking, is this actually money being used effectively? And so I wanted to, because I'm not here to tell you who, you know, exactly you're supposed to donate to, just like I'm not here to tell you what your opinion should be or your political affiliation should be. But this is can be a good starting point to think, you know, if I want to be a more effective ally, if I want to, and part of that, and again, that may or may not be a piece of that for you, but if you want to donate, it could be a starting point of getting some more kind of information about reputable organizations. So I wanted to provide that as a resource. So educating ourselves, obviously we've talked about that. What I will say, I think it's on the next slide here. Yeah, so again, this is absolutely not an exhaustive list, but a few of many resources. And I think that everybody, in terms of equity, learns differently. So some people learn from reading, some people learn from listening, watching something. So everybody's kind of way they get information. I think it's good to kind of have different mediums to learn that. And so these are just a few examples. Everyone will have access to these slides as well. So I don't, maybe should have said that earlier. So I don't want anyone to feel like you just showed me this whole list of resources and I won't be able to remember them all. You should have access to those slides. But, you know, I think this is, again, taking that time, like it says on here, to be willing to educate ourselves and take the time to do that. Okay. So let's see here. What I'm going to do, I'm not clicking past questions because I'm skipping it, but I wanted to get to this slide so you had our contact info just in terms of having that information in front of you. This webinar will be recorded. It should be on our YouTube page soon, but there'll be a recording of it. You'll also get an evaluation form that, of course, is optional, but that you can fill out about the training. We have those for all webinars, and you do have access to the slides themselves. So there's a question here about kind of how to challenge systemic and systematic racism and how does one accomplish that. Yeah, debating isn't effective with, a lot of people, if, again, like I was saying, it's kind of like they're so entrenched in their mentality that they're in. So a couple things I would say. Challenging systematic racism, that is things like voting, that is things like donating to organizations that fight against discriminatory policies. That is, for example, and I'm not saying this is the only way, but like for teachers, be like, I'm going to start making sure that our curriculum is equitable and more representative. So these are like concrete systematic things that we can try to do to implement change. Challenging systemic racism, that's about being aware of our own biases. If you are in HR or hiring people, be really aware of if you have your own biases when it comes to that. If you hear someone say something racist or do something racist, to confront that person in a respectful way, but call that out. So I would say those are kind of these two equally important things that we have to work on to challenge those systems, because one is that policy kind of law side of things, the systemic or systematic, I apologize. Systemic is just these day-to-day kind of implicit biases, the way that people are treated, the way that people are talked about, and that's the stuff that we need to really interrupt when we can. And doing that in real time is typically a lot more effective than getting into these like long kind of pointless debates on Facebook with someone who's, like totally entrenched in their racist ideology. So kind of shifting your energy away from that to something that might be a little bit more reasonable to make change. And I want to see here, I'm just trying to, I've got my little questions box and I don't want anyone to not be, I'm going to just kind of extend this questions box out a little bit. I'm sure everyone's loving that I'm giving you a play-by-play of what I'm doing on my end. Okay, let's see. I think we addressed most of those. I know someone, let's see. Yeah, a few people, and you're totally right. Obviously, some protesters are asking that police are eliminated. And again, kind of like we were talking about earlier, I'm not denying that there's protesters out there saying that. The main piece is just that on a more kind of overarching holistic perspective of what defund the police in terms of on the average kind of overarching goal there is not to just eliminate them completely. So just having kind of a wider lens of what that means, and then, kind of thinking about that more in that way. So someone had written about white privilege and that they're having kind of trouble with the concept. I think that's common for some people to, kind of struggle a little bit with that concept. And, they're talking about how, focus is on kind of white people's experience. And I think, and how we need to focus on how everyone's treated. Obviously, when we think about respecting people, that's respecting everyone. I think when we talk about white privilege, or again, any privilege, like I was giving examples about other things too, is that one of the biggest challenges with that concept is just, it can be really, really difficult for people within any privileged group to start taking a look at that. And I'm not at all implying that this person who wrote this means this. It just is making me think of a kind of a larger tangent. So I wanted to clarify on that. Of just being thoughtful about our willingness to take a look at our own privilege, and that is not that privilege is implying that someone's a bad person, or that they have economic standing, in terms of they're rich or something, or that they, again, are a bad person. It's about just recognizing these systems, and like that quote had said earlier, how does this impact me? If I can choose whether I want to think about this or not, that in of itself is privilege. And so how do I push through that and actually take the time to learn about this? Because like this individual is saying, this affects everybody. So injustice, and this isn't something I came up with, and we hear this sometimes, injustice against one group of people is injustice to a whole system. Everybody is, it's important that we recognize that and educate ourselves about that and look at that and try to all take on a role of improving the system that we're in. And the only way to do that, depending on where we fall within that system, is if we fall into one or multiple demographics that is in the privileged group, to be willing to still take a look at that and how we fit into that system to try to improve it for the people who are not in that privileged group. And it's a really long conversation. And I recognize, number one, in a webinar, it's hard because I completely understand I'm like talking at the group, and I want to try to make this as, as much of a discussion as possible, but this is something that we have to continue to talk about. So there are so many things to start thinking about. There are so many, places to start. And I hope that even just within this hour, even if there's, something to kind of take away as, I'm going to really try to focus on this for a while and think about what my implicit biases might be and how those have looked over, however long, and what could I do that was concrete strategy to make some improvements. And if you, again, and I tell this to every group, regardless of webinar, but I think it's important to remind everyone here too, is that the EAP is it's not just this webinar. So we have tons of resources on our website if you go to it. And again, you can see our contact info there. If you ever want to speak to a counselor, if you ever want to, process more about how you're feeling about this, what you want to work on, how you want to try to take some steps, is really, that's what we're here for. So you can always call us. I mean, our phone number is 24/7 if you need to speak to someone. We are here to support everybody and, use this time to educate and start a conversation. And, hopefully this is a starting point for that. And we had almost 300 people today, which is wonderful. It also means that if I didn't get to your question or didn't have time to get to it, I'm so sorry. It wasn't you. It's that we, had an hour and we've got hundreds of people watching today. And again, this will be recorded. You will get an eval form. I genuinely hope that this was informative and helpful. And I absolutely appreciate everybody's feedback, everyone's questions that they've typed in. It is wonderful to have and start a conversation like this. And I'm so glad that so many people attended today. I want to, of course, respect everyone's schedule, and it's 11:58. And so I know everyone has a really busy schedule. I absolutely recognize that we could talk about this for a lot longer. But if you do need anything else, if you need any further assistance from us or anything at all, please call us, email us, or text us. But I hope everyone has a good, safe rest of your week.